And without further ado, I just want to hand it off to Christine to take us out on a night in Toronto.
Old Toronto, of course. Not new Toronto. It's a pretty different scene now. I thank you so much, Chris, for this. I really appreciate your support with this and Bacardi's support with this. And thank you so much, Josh and Jessica, for this. Indeed, my third time being the final seminar, which always calls for a big stiff drink. I promised a pina colada, but it turns out to be a rather large old Cuban instead, because I ran out of pineapple juice. Anyhow, and thank you to all the people who have tuned in tonight. I appreciate you coming here, and I know it's late at night, and I hope you all also have a cocktail in hand, because this is a seminar about, you know, drinking in bars, so you should be definitely, you know, enjoying it if you'd like to. So anyhow, we're going to try to make it less like class and more like being in the bars. When I submitted this seminar, it was of course pre-pandemic, and the whole idea of doing it for me, and I never got any kind of approval as to whether or not this would actually be the case or not, because we didn't get that far, was that we would do this as a walking tour. That was my big idea for it. And so I was hoping that it would be scheduled for the very first day, and that we would do a tour down Yonge Street and down to King and Toronto, which is one of the big sort of areas that I'm going to be talking about, and through City Hall. And then it would serve as kind of more than just a history seminar, but would also be a little bit of a welcome to the city for all the people who come to TOCC normally from other parts of the world. Anyhow, obviously, I'm sitting here and not out there walking through, so it didn't obviously work out that way, but we're going to try to reproduce it as much as possible by showing you some current pictures too, so you can kind of get a sense. I don't know how many people are here from Toronto and are perfectly familiar with the geography versus how many people are here from elsewhere. So feel free to just ask the questions. I might not be able to get to them right away, but we can at least try to get to them towards the end. Anyhow, I also thought I would tell you, I'm going to load up a PowerPoint in a second here, but that the reason my interest in gay bars in Toronto actually started out with my interest in gay bars in the United States, because I wrote about the Stonewall Inn for my book, America Walks Into a Bar. And now I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint. I'll put it down at points if I can figure out how to do that, but hang on one second. I think that, you know, I'm trying to do this. I'm sorry, I just got a cat I got to get rid of. I'm trying to do this in terms of like not making it too heavy on needing. Sorry, screen sharing isn't just working right now. I'm just going to try it one more time. Okay, that's not good. I'll try it again here. Yeah, there we go. So I hope that the PowerPoint's up there. I can't see it. I just see Chris Bahamondes, but I'm going to assume that it is. And I'm going to.
It's not up.
Is it up now?
No.
Okay. Okay. We'll try it one more time. Anyhow, I'll just explain what I was saying. I think that most people probably know what Stonewall means and what the importance of Stonewall is. But in case you don't, I just have to pull this up. Can someone tell me if it's there yet?
It's there.
Sorry?
Yes.
It's there. Okay, terrific. Can you see all the back end stuff too?
Yes.
Okay. Can we live with that? Because it seems to go wrong when I change it into the play mode.
Yeah. Just give it a try one more time, just to see if it will look a bit nicer if we can see.
It will look nicer for sure.
At least bigger.
Okay. Can you see me?
Yeah, we got it.
And okay, terrific. All right. So this is Stonewall Inn in New York City, which is a funny place to start for a Toronto seminar. But I think most people, Stonewall doesn't need a lot of introduction, but just in case anybody has never heard of it, this is the mob-run dance bar in New York's West Village that was raided by police 3 times in a row in June of 1969. And this police harassment led to protests, which were actually sparked by Black and Latinx trans activists. And these protests sort of ultimately led to the whole idea of the Gay Pride Parade. I imagine most people are aware of that. The story is often told just really like it's a clean and easy story that led from one thing, you know, the raids on the bars to the protests, and then immediately that goes over to Pride. But it's actually, of course, much more complicated, as most history is. This is a picture of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And these were really 2 of the main people who were responsible for sparking the initial protests at Stonewall. And they kind of got written out of the whole narrative as it kind of got taken over by more sort of mainstream forces. And it became a much more kind of white movement as things went on. That's one of the complications about Stonewall. Another complication about Stonewall is that it didn't just come out of nowhere. You know, people didn't just suddenly decide that they were going to, you know, protest this unjust sort of treatment by police. There was actually years and years of stuff going on before, including, and this is my favorite part, the work of Jose Sarria in San Francisco, who is the middle character here doing a drag comic opera at the Black Cat Cafe in San Francisco, who is here doing one of his Sunday comic operas that he used to do. Now, the thing about Jose Sarria is he was a waiter and he was a drag performer at the Black Cat Cafe. And in addition, he was the first openly gay man to ever run for office. And in the United States, that is, sorry. Anyhow, this is well before Harvey Milk, you know, a decade before Harvey Milk. And part of the reason that he ran for office was because he wanted to run for the Board of Supervisors, because the police harassment of gay bars in San Francisco in the late 1950s was becoming kind of intolerable. So he decided that he would run for that. Now, Sarria didn't win the election. That would be, we would know more about him if he did. And he is a fairly famous figure, although, you know, in only some circles, he's a little obscure to like the public compared with, say, Harvey Milk. Anyhow, but Sarria didn't win, but he got 10,000 votes, which is a phenomenal number. And he said that after that moment, there was no candidate who would have run and not considered the queer population of San Francisco an important group to go and canvass with and to campaign with. So he's an important sort of figure that is really doing things 10 years before the time frame that we're told about. He's running for office 10 years before Stonewall. He's running for office 10 years before Harvey Milk, et cetera, all these things. Anyhow, so he was an important kind of part of the process, but it wasn't just that he ran for office. In addition, when he was working at the Black Cat Cafe, he would always be counseling people on ways to resist police arrests. And one of the things that he told me, and he told me so many different things. I'm sorry, Jose Sarria is no longer with us, but I did get a chance to interview him. He told everybody to wear a little pin on their outfit when they were in drag, and it would say, "I am a boy." And that way, he said, the police would not be able to arrest you for female impersonation. So I think that's a very political move that I think is easier for us to see now, that resisting police arrest is a very political move. And so part of it was the conventional politics that he did, and part of it was the non-conventional politics. anyhow, so that's what kind of got me into working on gay bars and trying to find out who has been doing political activism since the 1950s. And I mean, basically the long and the short of it is that nobody had really done a very thorough investigation of how Toronto's bars had fit in there. And so I wound up getting a grant to do it as a dissertation. And part of my motivation was that in addition to the fact that nobody had done it, I felt that there was probably raw material out there, because the LCBO has kept every piece of paper that they have issued to every bar about your glass washer, about the temperature of the water in your glass washer, about the seating of the capacity and where the tables are placed since 1947. So I felt like I had a good shot at being able to find some really interesting material. Anyhow, it didn't turn out quite that way. Nothing does. Instead, I wound up getting most of my material from tabloids, which are what you're looking at right here in front of you. In addition to LCBO files, I interviewed a lot of people. I read a lot of memoirs. There were some kind of CAMH studies done about bars and people who hang out in bars. I used that. But the tabloids were this really, really rich resource for what I was doing. And tabloids are obviously not Weekly World News at the time. They're very local. And so you would buy, I think this one is 10 cents. And you would buy this and you would wind up, I'm just going to check to make sure. And you would find out all sorts of gossip, including where the most popular bars are, although they would not necessarily be, they could be sort of lurid. Some of them, they weren't necessarily positive reports on everything. Sorry, I've just lost the, oh, we've got a blank slide there. Hang on one second. Okay. So anyhow, what I wound up finding was this very kind of convoluted and complicated story that I'm going to call Toronto the Gay, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It doesn't unfold exactly the way that people might have expected it to, but I do think it's sort of a fascinating story. I want to start here with the bad as opposed to the good, which would be the way you'd think that we would go. And these are not the worst places that I could have started with, but essentially Toronto, you know, did not have gay bars per se in the way that we have them on Church Street, for example, or had them after the 1980s on Church Street. What Toronto had was something called mixed bars, is the way that most people refer to them, places that you could go to and not be subjected to a discriminatory policy. So what we have here is two bars that you could afford to, that you could go to if you were a gay man in Toronto. And this is largely about gay men as opposed to lesbians, although I'll get to that and explain that in a bit. If you could afford to drink at the Park Plaza's rooftop bar, then you would probably not be turned away, despite whatever your sexual comportment might have been, what your identity appeared to be. Apologies, I just thought maybe Josh and Jess were trying to get a hold of me. Okay. Anyhow, these would be, the Park Plaza, for anyone who doesn't live in Toronto, is now the Park Hyatt, and it's at Avenue Road in Bloor. And this would be a very expensive bar. Currently, the hotel bar at the rooftop is actually closed, but it will reopen, and it will be a glorious thing, I'm sure. And it's a sort of a famous kind of spot in Toronto that most people know because it had, you know, really one of the best views in the city. And so a couple of doors down, where the Intercontinental Hotel now is, if you're familiar with that, this Chez Paree was there. And these would have been relatively expensive places in Yorkville. And if you could afford to go there, you would almost certainly get served, and you might be able to pick somebody up, and you might be able to meet friends. But that was really something that you could only afford if you were relatively well off. Now, if you couldn't afford to drink at a bar like that, you might have wound up in a neighborhood called the Corners. So Jessica and I did a tour. We did the walking tour so that you could see what the places look like now, because they've changed an awful lot. Now up here, you know, you've got me doing the walking tour, and behind me is the Sheraton Hotel, and in front of me would be City Hall. And so this is the corner of Queen and Bay. And because we're all, you know, most of us don't remember anything before City Hall, it's quite surprising to even really think about what might have been there before City Hall. But what was there was actually low-rise commercial and residential all throughout the neighborhood. And this was what you may have heard is called the Ward, this area, which is an area of town that was essentially demolished because a lot of the people who didn't live in the ward had a lot of kind of anxieties about the type of behaviors that were going on in the ward. And also the people who lived in the ward, because basically what we're talking about is people who might have thought Take Back Canada would be like a good slogan for a political campaign or something along those lines. So the ward was extremely unpopular with a segment of Torontonians who felt that, you know, this was a dangerous place where people went slumming. And part of the anxiety around the ward would have really been focused on the bars that were right along Queen Street at Bay. And I don't think it's too conspiratorial to say that's in part why they were destroyed. So this photo below obviously is from 1970. And you can see that these bars, the Union House and the Municipal and the theaters that were along there are still existent in 1970. They did not last much long after that, but they were there before that. And so here's two pictures that I think are particularly beautiful for reimagining what the city might have looked like at the time. And you can see this is facing east on Queen Street, and you can see Old City Hall there, and you can see the Variety Hotel on the north side of the street, basically where, you know, a hot dog vendor kind of roughly would be at this point in time, if you know this, if you know Toronto. And the Variety Hotel was one of the few places that did not have a discriminatory policy put in place that barred lesbians. So that was kind of an important hotel that was demolished when they built City Hall. And then across the street is the Union Hotel, which was one of the places that you could go if you were a gay man, and also women as well. And you would not necessarily be discriminated against by the bouncers or the bartenders or the people who were running the management. And next to the Union, oh, sorry, this is, I just thought people might want to see the inside of things too. This is the ladies' beverage room in the Variety Hotel, as you can read from the caption. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the way that bars were separated and gendered in a second. But the other place that I wanted to show you here is the Hotel Municipal, or as people in the interviews would always call it, the Municipal. And the Municipal was a very important hotel, as was the Union. So these two hotels were about 2 doors away from each other. And you see here, this is the interior shot, and I wanted to show you this because, first of all, it's very hard to get interior shots of Toronto bars in the 1940s and 50s. And so this is a rare one that was been snuck out of somebody's files. And you can see that this is not exactly a dynamic drinking area that you're going to have a really great time with. The laws were very strict about what could go on in a beverage room in a hotel. So the beverage room in a hotel was only allowed to sell beer. And these are a remnant of immediately after Prohibition was repealed in 1934, the first public drinking that we got after Prohibition was repealed in 27 was in 1934. And they started to put these beer parlors in And these are, some of you may be old enough to remember like the last remnants of them at the Brunswick House, where people were sold like beer in little tiny glasses like this. It would have been absolutely terrible beer. And it would have been, you were not really allowed to order more than one at a time, but most people did. They ordered as many as the server would bring them because they were just tiny little 8-ounce glasses. But the principal attraction of them would be that they were 5 or 10 cents. So if you couldn't afford a cocktail that was $1.10 or something like that at the rooftop of the Park Plaza, you could certainly afford a nickel beer or a dime beer at one of these beer parlors. And until 1947, it wasn't legal to sell liquor in a bar at all in Ontario. You could only sell beer through the beer parlors, and hard liquor was completely disallowed until 1947. And that's when that changed. And at that moment, we started getting 2 different types of bars opening up in Toronto. We had the old beer parlors and we had the new cocktail lounges. Not only was it great that people could drink liquor finally after 1916 to 1947, 31 years of no legal liquor allowed in public drinking spaces in Toronto or Ontario as a whole, but men and women were allowed to drink together in the cocktail taverns. But these beverage rooms that we're looking at over on the right side of the screen, those are divided into women's beverage rooms and men's beverage rooms. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this is that the Ontario government actually was more progressive than the people at the time. The Ontario government, when they first opened up the beer parlors in 1934, they didn't have them gender segregated. But the people of Toronto protested until they wound up getting this sort of ladies and escorts room and then the men's beverage room, so that the men and women would essentially be drinking apart. And so that was, you know, really at the behest of like a bunch of religious leaders who went around Toronto and thought it was completely scandalous to see men and women drinking together in 34. But for once, you cannot blame the LCBO. It was not their fault. They were actually trying to be cooler than the Toronto was ready to be. So anyhow, this is the municipal. And the municipal was not just a cheap place to be, it was also an extraordinarily dangerous place to be. There were knife fights happening in there all the time. I read one interview with a guy and he said, you know, he went in there with his friend and his friend says, anything that happens, just duck under one of the tables before we go, you know, and then we'll try to find a time to run out while everybody is distracted. And they said 5 minutes later, there was a knife fight in the bar. But there was also, these were dangerous spaces. The courtroom, Toronto Old City Hall, was right across the street. So, you know, there was a huge mix of people, but there was also sort of a lot of kind of heartening stuff going on. One of the memoirs that's really important for learning all this stuff is Jim Egan, who was an important activist in this era in the 1950s. And he said the municipal and the union were called the Board of Trade and the Chamber of Commerce, or sometimes the Bucket of Blood clubs. They were frequented by flamboyant characters, drag queens, hustlers, panhandlers, working class gays, and older men, workman types. And the older men would usually drink their beer and mind their own business. And these weren't actually even exclusively white places. These were relatively mixed when it comes to, not massively mixed, but they weren't also having discriminatory policies against racialized people as well. So they would have been predominantly white, but they were not segregated. And some of the characters that hung out in the municipal set were Miss Jeffries, Mad Arlene, Madam Mamie, Miss Pearly Victorious, Frances, and Geraldine. And Geraldine was the toast of the municipal set, a hustler with porcelain features and makeup galore, known for her notorious drag ensembles, but who could pass with straight men. And the bartenders were often really quite helpful when there was actually a conflict in the bar. And of course, a lot of the drag queens could also take care of themselves quite well. So it was an interesting little space that we're talking about at the Corners. which was at Queen and Bay. And probably more interesting than we'd expect, but it definitely had its sort of negative elements. I want to move on to just the other side of City Hall. This would be 150 Dundas West. As you can see, the building is still there, but it's been given a hideous makeover and made to look even worse. And it wasn't the most beautiful building in the first place, but it certainly doesn't look it's much worse than it was. Anyhow, this was the Continental House, and the Continental was the other bar in Toronto that did not have a discriminatory policy towards lesbians. And it was also a fairly rough bar. And this was just, you know, sort of into the ward, which is the neighborhood that was demolished to build City Hall. And sort of this would have been like kind of the heart of Chinatown at the time. And then if you look a little bit further east, this is Dundas and Bay. And see, there I am doing my little walking tour and explaining to people what's going on at the Ford Hotel, which would have been behind me if the atrium at Bay wasn't there anymore. So this is a 1928 photograph of the Ford Hotel, which is was a very prominent hotel that was supposed to be meant to be a very good hotel at first, but it became known as the Queen of the Dumps by the time it was actually demolished, and it was totally demolished to make the atrium at Bay. But it's such a quiet intersection by comparison to what is there right now. Anyhow, the Ford Hotel was what the columnists in the tabloids called a middle-class hotel. And so this was sort of the midpoint, and they had a cocktail bar, and they had in it, they had a place, I have a picture of it, the interior here. It's not a great picture, but this is the Tropical Lounge at the Ford Hotel, where the word was "meet me under the palms." And this is a really excellent thing to demonstrate what I'm talking about with the bad and the discriminatory policies. At one point, they decided that they were going to, you know, clean up the Ford Hotel, and they were going to try to change the clientele. And so they actually, the management went and they handed out little cards saying, you know, please don't come back here anymore. Your patronage in the future is not going to be, is not something we want. Anyhow, instead of taking that card and, you know, walking out or choosing to never come back, they had the people who hung out at this bar had all manner of creative ways of dealing with the solution. They pretended that they were calling cards from their admirers. They collected them all. Some of the people just tore them up. There were, you know, just a number of different ways in which people were determined to hold on to their bar, and they weren't going to be told that they had to leave their bar regardless of the fact that they, you know, this discriminatory policy had come into place. And I think that's a really interesting thing about Toronto, is people just tended to try to hold on to their bars as much as humanly possible. And then this is the King Edward Hotel. Most everyone in Toronto will recognize it. And this is kind of one of the most horrible examples of trying to implement a discriminatory policy. And I had the headline in one of the tabloids from before at the beginning for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or The Bad, the Good, and the Ugly. And this is one of the most sort of sensational and famous moments in which a hotel or a bar manager decided that they were going to implement a policy of discrimination. And the King Edward Hotel had been, I don't know, had been collecting a lot of money off of its gay patronage in several different, or two different of its bars for a fairly long time. And then suddenly they decided to change their policy. And it's not actually clear whether it's because there was a new manager, which there was, or whether it had something to do with what was going on across the street. And this is my favorite part of the whole story. You may wonder what letros queers are, and I'll explain that now. This is the intersection today. I'm there in front of the bar that was in front of the place that once housed the bar Letros, trying to explain what exactly happened on this street that's so fantastic. And this is really the heart of the thing that I think is amazing about Toronto and its gay history, which was that across from the King Edward, which was home to several gay bars, there was a phenomenal gay bar called Letros across the street. And in fact, it was the basement of the bar called the Nile Room that was the best part of it. And every year for 20 years on Halloween, and not just on Halloween, at other occasions too, Letros hosted a absolutely massive drag ball. And the earliest that I can find evidence of it is going back to 1949. So this is really quite early. The last drag ball at Letros on Halloween was, I believe, 1969. So this is what we're looking at. But what's amazing about these balls is the scale of them and the scope of them. And some of you who will have seen the teasers online will have some idea that this is what we're looking at here. And if you see at the on the far right corner, you can see that's the King Edward Hotel. And so what we're looking at is we're looking at it from roughly the entrance of Letros. And then on the left picture, that is the entrance of Letros. And what I think is amazing is, this is from 1967, but I've read every tabloid report of all of these drag balls, and they were this well attended over and over and over again, year after year. Thousands of people poured into the streets to watch the drag contestants go in and compete to become Miss Letros of every year. And this was a fantastic spectacle. The Toronto Star never wrote about it. The Globe and Mail never wrote about it. The Toronto Telegram eventually did write about it. But the Toronto Telegram was right on the same block, and that was one of the major dailies. Another thing that's great is one of the biggest police stations was just around the corner on Court Street. If you go north on Toronto from Letros, which is the little corner, one of the largest police stations in all of Toronto was right there. So this was not, nobody was hiding at this point. This was an absolutely out in the open spectacle. In the 60s, the TV stations would come down and they would cover it, and things would go on the evening news. And one of the reasons that it could be so open is because Letros was gay owned and was staffed by gay people and had a predominantly gay clientele, which is a rarity in Toronto. It's a rarity anywhere in North America in the 1950s. And the reason that he was able to be so open about everything was because it was actually his father who had opened it. And his father was very hesitant to have a gay clientele, but his father died prematurely in 1953, and George Letros got to run the bar, essentially, as far as I can tell, exactly the way he wanted to. So he threw some really great parties. And what I think is so wonderful about this, and the fact that we have these pictures, and the fact that I've done all these interviews and talked to so many people, is you can see how there is a Mardi Gras-like aspect to what's going on here. That these are people, these may be gawkers. They may not be great allies of the queer community. They're here to laugh at people, but they are having a really spectacularly fun time. And there's this wonderfully playful element between the audience and between the queens who are going in to the event. And of course, you could never get into Letros unless you were very well connected at that point, or one of the performers. That was the very best way to get in, was to actually become one of the contestants, because it was such a popular event and it was so well known and people had such an incredibly fun time at it. This is you might think I'm romanticizing it, and I probably am a little tiny bit, but I read account after account. And, this is a guy named Joe Tensi, and he worked for one of the tabloids, and he said, using busy car-swollen King Street as a stage, the belles walked from one curb to the other. And to and fro, the pretty things went, mincing, camping, hamming it up, weaving between cars. And then he says that from the windows from the King Edward across the street, people would open up and they'd be yelling down and they'd be asking for people's phone numbers, and the drag queens would do bows and they would throw kisses. And I mean, it's just sort of this wonderful scene that I think that most of us don't really expect for Toronto, the good. This is 1961, obviously, Miss Letros. I had the honor of being able to interview Neil Gilson, who was the 1961 Miss Letros. And this is the wonderful thing about history when it works like this, and it doesn't always, is that I could listen to Neil's account of that night and how he had won, and how many people were there and the flash bulbs going off and the scene that was going on. But then I could also read about it from Joe Tensi as well. And so Joe Tensi is the reporter who wrote about it every year. And he says, she is something you could bring home to meet your mother, if only you could trust your old man. And then he said that all the male admirers were asking for her phone number. And Joe Tensi says, I have the number, it's top secret, and I'm not giving it to anybody. So anyhow, I think it's really a very interesting moment in Toronto that we don't really tend to hear very much about. It's sort of hidden. And most people don't realize we had this kind of, I mean, to me, it's a very cool interface. So I did one slide too much. So, but this is my central point here. One thing that I want to kind of draw attention to is the role of the police in terms of managing the crowds. And again, you see a lot of smiling faces and a lot of happy people. In one of the pictures, there was somebody who had brought their dog down to watch the whole thing. And you see that you have this picture here of the policeman escorting this character, this drag queen into Letros and helping everyone in and helping everyone to the front door safely through the crowds and making sure that everyone is, having a good time, and nobody is getting hurt. And, again, you might think I'm romanticizing it or reading too much into it, but I think the pictures say a lot. But in addition, I did so many interviews with people about how the police reacted. And here's Don Middleton, who had been there one night. Even though he was a regular at Letros, he couldn't get in. It was just too busy. And he said, and then there was this great big cop trying to control the crowd so the streetcars could get through. He handled it so well. He stepped off the curb and he minced his way across the street. I mean, really mincing. And he said, now girls, if you'll just get back. And he said, he had no trouble with the crowd whatsoever that night. There wasn't even a hint of any violence, and that the officer had even encouraged the fun. I mean, this is almost impossible for me to imagine at this point in time. Look at this picture here. With the cop is actually in the car tolerating this photo op, and just sort of everyone's keeping things light and keeping the crowd in order. And it's really a wonderful kind of job that they have been doing here. And there may be violent incidents that I have missed, but I've really tried to uncover as much as humanly possible. And I really haven't found any violent incidents from the Letros drag ball, despite the fact that it was out in the open and it happened for 20 full years in a period when Canada was extremely hostile to the queer community. So I think it's sort of an amazing little story and a happy little bit of nostalgia for a time when things worked fairly well. In the early 1960s, a second drag ball opened up at the St. Charles Tavern on Yonge Street, which is this is about 490 Yonge Street. I'll show you a picture in a second. And it's maybe 480, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. Anyhow, it's between College and Wellesley. The St. Charles Tavern started to have a drag ball in the early 60s, and it was the rival drag ball for 10 or so years until Letro's closed in 1970. So anyhow, in this period, the bouncers still described this as a Mardi Gras-like atmosphere, Halloween every year. This is the St. Charles Tavern. Anybody in Toronto will know exactly where this is. It's on Yonge Street. And if you'll look at the size of that bar, you realize this is a massive, massive bar. And it was actually a cocktail tavern. And then you can see, this is where Jess and I went down and we took the pictures so that you can see exactly where it is right now. And the reason that the clock tower is still standing is because it's historically significant enough in order to be considered a something that we have to preserve. A heritage landmark. There's actually going to be an art piece exhibit that's going to go with it, despite the fact that the entire site is being turned into a condo or whatever it is. They're all condos, I think. Anyhow, so that's the St. Charles Tavern, and I'll explain why it's so significant in just a couple of seconds, but I want to just build out the scene a tiny bit more and tell you about this bar, which is, I mentioned that the St. Charles was 480 or 4 something Yonge Street. This is 530 Yonge Street, and it's about 150 meters north of the St. Charles. So these are 2 bars that are incredibly close together. At some point, they even actually were owned by the same owners, because they were doing, I can't remember right now whether they owned the Parkside first or the St. Charles. At any rate, they realized it was such good business that they bought the other bar. And so this would have been kind of a little scene where you could go back and forth, and on Halloween, certainly people would have hung out at the Parkside and then checked into the St. Charles to see what was going on and things along those lines. So there was a little kind of area, you know how everyone here knows something about bars, that, you know, you get a little patch of bars together and they do better. And all of the areas in Toronto that we've looked at had little areas where there were 2 or 3 bars that you could go back and forth between. And across from these 2, there was a hotel called the Westbury, which is now the Courtyard Marriott, and that also had a beer parlor that didn't have a discriminatory policy in fairly early on in the 1950s and 60s. It was quite there. So there were these 3 bars that were all kind of together. The Parkside is kind of infamous. Both of the bars became quite infamous. And again, we're looking at a massive, massive bar. And this is from 1937, when it was still called the Hotel Breadalbane, because it's at the corner of Yonge and Breadalbane. And this is us doing our little gay bar tour. And what I'm pointing at is the back men's entrance, which became the source of a lot of trouble, because you could actually go into the men's entrance on the side here and go to the bathroom without ever going into the beverage room. So it became this sort of difficult space for the bar to police, and it was rather difficult for everybody to deal with. The Parkside management solution was to allow the police to come into the bar and use the storage space next to the bathroom and actually peer into people using the bathroom. And they would spend hours there, apparently peering through a vent, crouched up, you know, or crouched down and standing on a chair looking into this thing. For hours and hours, in the hopes that somebody would, you know, have sex in the bathroom. And then they would go and they would arrest them. So this is a huge violation of policy and this entrapment scheme that was going on in this period of time. And it lasted for 10 full years, maybe not every single day or even every single week. There may have even been months where they didn't do it at all. But there were 10 years where going into the bathroom, you might be being monitored. Anyhow, so this is where I say this is where we're getting into the ugly. And the years that it was being monitored were all throughout the 1970s, which is when things became a lot more tense on Yonge Street in general, but particularly between these two bars. And you may remember this from the beginning. This is my picture from the ugly. This is the Halloween ball 1978 on Yonge Street. And now we're looking at something which to me looks like something from The Purge. And it's such a stark contrast to what we were looking at on King Street between the King Eddy and Letros in the 1960s. So what happened in the late 1970s is that there were just an awful lot of relatively young people, many of them coming from the suburbs, who came down to form mobs and to taunt the drag queens who were going into the St. Charles. And instead of this sort of happy scene where people were bringing their dogs and laughing and interacting, people were pelting eggs and pelting tomatoes and even yelling, "Kill the queers, kill the queers." And this is what Toronto in the late 1970s looked like on Halloween on Yonge Street. And, you know, I have a picture here from the archives of Halloween 1978 with, you know, somebody who's, you can see all of that is eggs that have been thrown, and the entire sidewalk is just a slippery sort of mass of yolks and whites. And it's such a, to me, a very stark contrast to what, you know, we were looking at. And so here I've put the two together so you can see, I think, the difference between the angry faces in the crowds and the damage that's being done to people, and they call it a hate fest that happened throughout the end of the 1970s. So what I think is really interesting about this, and I will turn it over to you guys in your questions right now, is that we have this idea in kind of contemporary culture that things get better and that things make progress, that we make progress. And we have this example here of progress being reversed, or a sense of progress being reversed. People are not getting more tolerant. People are getting less tolerant. People are not getting more accepting. People are getting more violent. And that's an interesting thing that, you know, from a historian's perspective, that, you know, to be able to find a spot where you can so clearly demonstrate to conditions deteriorating instead of progressing. So I think it's interesting from that point of view. The other thing that is really interesting to me about all of this is the role of the police. And I think it's very timely to be thinking about this right now, because the role that the police played in the 1967 photos and the 20 years that things were happening on King Street was one, to serve and protect, and to treat, for the large part, from everything I've learned, really to treat all of the participants with respect and to be mindful of their safety. What happened on Yonge Street is they stopped protecting the drag ball participants at the St. Charles, and they started to let the mobs form. It's interesting when you find out the way they eventually solved the problem at the St. Charles is they negotiated with the police to do their job. And that was all they needed to do, was to ask the police to do their job and to get the police to agree to do it, and to actually just not let the mobs form. That's all. They just had to put up some barricades and tell people, you can't stop, you can walk down Yonge Street and that's fine, but you just can't stop and form a mob. They didn't have to take eggs from people. They didn't have to arrest people necessarily. They just had to do their job and not let the crowds form. And I think that it's very telling that we have this incident where you don't have police interested in protecting the people who they are absolutely paid to protect, and taking sides with the mobs in this case, because I think obviously you're seeing that as a totally politically motivated issue. And I mean, if you look at Portland right now, we've got the same thing going on. We've got Proud Boys clashing with Black Lives Matter, and the police have been taking a stance, and they haven't been arresting the Proud Boys, and they have been letting it go on. And so I think that there's just an awful lot that you can learn from this story, and that you can take as, you know, sadly, a things never change moment. And sadly, perhaps things don't always get better. But I think that there's a lot to learn here in terms of those of us who would like to try to make things better in the end, because there is a model for things working better than they do right now. And one of the reasons that I brought up Jose Sarria is that it was his idea that the police needed oversight and running for office in order to try to make the police work better and do their job. And I think it's, you know, he did a lot of work in terms of making it better. And I think that, of course, we can too. So that's really my long spiel. I'm gonna take off the PowerPoint. I'm gonna look and see if anybody is still here. I'm gonna look at the, where the Letras family now. Are they still bar owners? No, the Letras family actually got out of, in 1970 when Letros ceased to be a thing. The George's sister had wanted to sell the building and get the money out of the building. And George, as I heard that he went and he worked at Simpson's until he retired. Is that it? Is there anything in the chat I should be looking for? There are no open questions. I just must have gone way too fast. I'm going to look at the chat. The cat rocks. Yeah, there is a lot of joy in these images. Thank you. Thank you for coming, Sherry Rohr.
I've also just allowed it so if anyone wants to unmute themselves if they have something more to say, because
Great.
I realize it might be easier to speak something than type it at this point. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in right now.
Marta, I missed your question. Do you want to?
Marta's is in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Ah, got it. If any, I don't know if you can all see this. Besides the police having a less hands-on approach to protect the performers, what was happening in societal or socio-political climate in Toronto at the time that created the stark change in the public's reaction to the drag balls in the 1970s versus earlier? Excellent question, which will take me only 4 or 5 hours to answer. But there were a ton of different things that were going on in that time, including a massive evangelical rise that happened at that point. Oh, I'll put answer live. Oh, thank you. There was a huge sort of evangelical uprising that happened in that period, and there were an awful lot of people who were advocating for sort of the Real Woman campaign. Like, I don't know if any of you saw the American Woman show on HBO, but there was this sort of idea that women needed to go back into the home and that women's liberation had failed. And I think that a lot of that sort of fundamental, I'm going to call it fascism, you know, that return to traditional values really has an awful lot to do with how things changed. In addition, though, I should point out that radio DJs were actually encouraging the kids to buy eggs and to go down there and to pelt them. And then the final thing, I think people make too much of this sometimes, is that in 1977, there was, I'm going to blank on the name, Emmanuel Jacques was killed on Yonge Street. And the circumstances around it are kind of complicated, but it was definitely sort of connected to the sex trade, and the people in the entire queer community became a scapegoat for this murder that happened, and it definitely made people more angry than they had been before. But I think that's just, you know, an incident that happened that sparked a lot of anger that was already kind of brewing with the changes that were happening with evangelicalism, and a backlash towards the feminist movement, and a backlash towards progressive change that had been happening in the 1960s. So I do think it's a much bigger story. I didn't know that people in the Simpsons got screwed out of their pension, and that's great. And then I wanted to answer one question. Well, I guess Chris, you know, I think I've sort of answered why I think things changed so much in the late 1970s. As to the bar interiors, Julia Siegel, I wanted to mention what I think that one of the problems is that you had to get a permission at certain points from the LCBO in Ontario. I can only speak to the Ontario issue. You had to get permission from the LCBO sometimes to do any kind of filming or photo shoots in certain eras in bars, because they didn't want people to look like they were promoting the bar life. And so to some degree, we have a dearth of photos because it was difficult to get in there and to take those photos. If you go to the LCBO files, which I do not recommend anyone ever doing, because it's a huge pain, you can look at all of the LCBO photos, but you are not allowed to copy them and take them out. So, but that wasn't true 20 or 30 years ago. So the ones that exist, like those two that I showed, those are actually probably smuggled out of LCBO files. And then there's just the fact that people, I don't know, didn't do as much sort of lifestyle restaurant reporting and bar reporting at the time. So there would be less reason to take interior photographs. There was people advertised from restaurants more likely than got written up unless it was a serious review. So I think there are a number of different things that play there. How did the King Edward's War end up? Yes, the queer community totally ended up reclaiming the bar later. If indeed the very few bars did not wind up getting reclaimed later. I think this is one of the wonderful things about Toronto's queer community from that era, is that they just decided that they belonged where they belonged and they went back. And, you know, probably most places really did want the money anyhow and wanted to have people back from the cynical point of view. So yes, it was the King Eddie, absolutely was. And now they're trying to make a virtue of their history of having been home to a lot of gay bars. And they're actually quite proud of it. When I did my Out and About walking tour, that was our final stop. We did the walk from the Parkside and the St. Charles Hotel. We went down Yonge Street. We went over to the Ford, to the behind City Hall, and then we looked at City Hall where those bars no longer exist, and then we landed at the King Eddie. And we told them before that we would be there, and they were thrilled to have us because, you know, it's obviously a very different kind of scene now. And yeah, so that indeed. Vincent, do you think the situation has gotten better overall, though? Toronto seems very tolerant to me. I mean, I've experienced issues as a bisexual man in Toronto, but less than in London or really elsewhere. I mean, you know, I don't know what better. I can't really speak to it because it's not something that I have to deal with. I mean, I find it very disheartening now to find stories about gay bashing and things that happen on the streets these days, and it certainly isn't completely perfect here. I guess I think that things are better overall. They certainly, you would not see that mob forming on Yonge Street today. I hope that we don't in 5 years. But I guess my point is that I think that things don't always get better. They sometimes get worse. And I certainly hope that we all work to make the difference and try to make sure that it doesn't ever go back to that again. But I think with, Erin O'Toole, not to make this too overly political, talking about taking back Canada, there is a danger right now. And I think we have to be vigilant to make sure that that doesn't change. When did the bars begin to move a block east to Wellesley from Yonge, and why the move? That's a perfect question. And because I really wanted to mention this, that we always think of Church Street as, the sort of the gay village. And of course it is. And of course it has been for some time. And a lot of that was motivated because the St. Charles and the Parkside's owners were completely mercenary jerks who were exploiting their clientele. And so one of the problems is that you're exploiting your clientele in order to make the money off of your patrons, but you're not protecting them. You're letting the police have an entrapment scheme in the bathroom. You're not working with the police outside to make sure that the mobs are not going to attack the drag queens. And when you continue to do that, eventually somebody is going to move 2 blocks over and open up an alternative. And that is what finally happened. But it took, a fair bit of capital to be able to open up a bar, but some properly gay owned bars opened up on Church Street, which was a cheaper street to open up at the time. And people had really just had enough of, it was the Bolters who owned the Parkside and the St. Charles. They had had enough of spending their money there, but being treated terribly. So that largely happened in the, right around like the same era as the bathhouse raids. Which some people, I think, erroneously call our Stonewall. I don't think that's quite I don't think that's the perfect way to think about it. But after that, there was a real sort of sense of wanting to create a corner that was actually safe as opposed to sort of pretend safe. And that happened almost immediately after the last big the reform of the police happened in 80, and in 81, that's when I hope I have those dates right. That's when the bathhouse raids happened after that. And that's when people moved over to Church Street. Were the legal consequences for proprietors for being permissive or welcoming of queer patrons in the 1950s and 1960s, or was it purely social norms? Perfect. Indeed, we were, I suppose the word is lucky. In Ontario, the AGCO, which at the time was called the LLBO, did not have any rules about running something called a gay bar. There were no contraindications or bars barring of the type of patron that you had, in part, I think, because they were trying to avoid discrimination charges. So in California, and in New York, they had to have legal challenges to see whether or not having a gay bar was legal or not. In Ontario, that really never came up there because there was no law against it. And as I said, I really didn't find, I couldn't get into the police files. Nobody can. People have spent their entire careers trying to get into the police files, and it's very difficult to get anything out of them. So I couldn't thoroughly interrogate this, but I never heard anybody say that there was a real raid on a bar in the way that we think of a raid, where the police came in and wanted to, absolutely arrest all of the people in there for being in a gay space. I have never heard that story told about Toronto. It is not to say that it couldn't possibly have happened. It might have happened, but I couldn't find it. What that tells me is that there weren't many, if there were. And that the raids sometimes happened in unlicensed spaces. And I think that the fact that the LBO didn't have any discriminatory language about the type of patronage in there might have made it reasonable to assume that there weren't, it might have made it safer in terms of the police doing raids. So no, yeah, there were no legal consequences to proprietors for being permissive at all.
I think that's all the questions there, Christine.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for everyone who's here. Yeah, Camper is saying, I wish I could have been there for the walking tour and talk in person. Thanks, Christine. Let's try to do it for real
Next year.
in the future. Yeah.
Yeah.
Camper will be there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Have a great night, everyone.